The cold wind cut through the city like a blade, rattling the windows of the hospital chapel. Inside, Chaplain Daniel Hayes sat in silence, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of a worn-out Bible. The air was thick with sorrow, the kind that settles in places where prayers are whispered in desperation. He had seen it all: grief that came like a tidal wave, faith that flickered in the face of suffering, and questions that had no easy answers. But tonight, as he sat in the dim glow of candlelight, one question hung in the air heavier than the rest. Where is God when bad things happen? It wasn't the first time Daniel had been asked that question, and it wouldn't be the last. He had heard it from parents who had lost their children, from soldiers who had seen war tear apart their souls, from patients whose bodies were failing them. But tonight, the question came from someone he never expected: himself. Hours earlier, he had stood in the hospital hallway, watching as a mother clung to her son's lifeless body. The boy had been hit by a drunk driver, a cruel twist of fate that shattered a future filled with endless possibilities. The mother's screams had pierced through the walls, a sound so raw it made even the doctors turn away. And Daniel, who was supposed to have the words, the comfort, the wisdom, had nothing. Now, alone in the chapel, he closed his eyes and whispered, "God, where are you?" The silence was deafening. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Nurse Rachel standing there, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists. She had been at the boy's side, had done everything she could, and still, it hadn't been enough. "I need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, motioning for her to sit. She hesitated before stepping inside, as if entering sacred ground. "I don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "I prayed. His mother prayed. Everyone prayed. And he still died. How do you do it, Chaplain? How do you keep believing when it feels like God isn't listening?" Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had asked himself the same thing more times than he could count. People expected him to have answers, but the truth was, he wrestled with doubt just like everyone else. "I don't always understand," he admitted. "I wish I did." Rachel looked at him, her eyes searching for something: hope, maybe, or just honesty. "I used to believe God had a plan," she said. "But if he does, I don't think I like it." Daniel had no argument against that. What could he say? That pain was part of some grand design. That suffering had a purpose. Those words might be true, but they felt hollow in moments like this. "Maybe faith isn't about understanding," he finally said. "Maybe it's about holding on, even when we don't." Rachel scoffed. Holding on to what? Before he could answer, the chapel door creaked open again. This time, it was Mrs. Holloway, the boy's mother. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched the cross around her neck. "I don't know why I came here," she said, her voice raw. I don't know where else to go." Daniel stood, his heart pounding. "You're always welcome here." She shook her head. "I don't even know if I believe anymore. What kind of God lets a child die? What kind of God answers some prayers, but not others?" The question lingered in the air, thick with emotion. Rachel turned away, her own struggle mirrored in the mother's grief. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their pain pressing down on him. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Holloway took a shaky breath. "But I don't know how to stop believing either." Daniel met her eyes, something stirring deep within him. He didn't have all the answers. He never would. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe faith wasn't about certainty. Maybe it was about showing up, even in the darkness. Maybe it was about holding each other up when God felt far away. As he reached out, his fingers barely grazing hers, A thought crossed his mind, one he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. What if the real question wasn't asterisk, where is God, when bad things happen asterisk? What if the real question was asterisk, where are we asterisk? And in that moment, as the weight of grief filled the chapel, Daniel knew this wasn't the end of the story. It never was. Mrs. Holloway's fingers barely twitched in Daniel's grasp before she pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold together the pieces of her breaking heart. Her eyes flickered toward the candles at the front of the chapel, their flames dancing with a quiet persistence, oblivious to the weight of sorrow that filled the room. "I keep thinking he's going to wake up," she whispered, "like this is some kind of mistake." Daniel swallowed hard. He had seen grief do that, make the mind play tricks, make reality feel like something that could be rewritten if only you prayed hard enough, believed deep enough. He wished he could tell her something that would help, but there were no magic words for this kind of pain. Rachel sat stiffly beside him, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were turning white. She hadn't spoken since Mrs. Holloway came in, but Daniel could feel the tension rolling off her, the way her chest rose and fell with shallow, measured breaths. "I was supposed to be at work," Mrs. Holloway continued, her voice breaking. "I was going to stay late, but something told me to go home early. And when I got there, he was already out riding his bike. If I had just left 10 minutes sooner, maybe." Her voice cut off, strangled by the weight of what-ifs. Daniel leaned forward. "You can't do that to yourself." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Can't I? It's all I can do. Go back over every single second, wondering what I could have done differently, wondering why God didn't step in." Rachel suddenly shot up from her seat. "Maybe he wasn't there," she said, her voice sharp and uneven. Mrs. Holloway blinked, startled, but Rachel wasn't looking at her. She was staring at Daniel, her eyes burning with something close to anger. "You keep saying we have to hold on," she said, "that we have to believe even when we don't understand. But what if we're wrong? What if this," she motioned wildly to the chapel, to the flickering candles, to the crucifix on the wall. "What if it's all just something we tell ourselves so we don't fall apart?" The room went still. Daniel felt the weight of both women's eyes on him, waiting, expecting. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. Rachel scoffed, shaking her head. "That's what I thought." She turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. Mrs. Holloway watched her go, then turned back to Daniel, searching his face. "She's right, isn't she?" she asked softly. "You don't have an answer." Daniel's throat tightened. "I don't." Mrs. Holloway let out a slow, shaky breath, then stood. "I should go. I don't know why I thought coming here would help." She hesitated at the doorway, as if waiting for him to call her back, to give her something, anything that would make sense of what had happened. But Daniel remained silent, and after a moment, she walked out into the night, leaving the chapel emptier than before. For a long time, Daniel just sat there, staring at the candles, watching how their flames swayed, how they refused to go out even when the wind sneaked in through the cracks beneath the door. Rachel's words rang in his head, over and over. Asterisk, what if we're wrong, asterisk? The thought clung to him like a shadow as he finally pushed himself to his feet and stepped out into the hallway. The hospital was quieter now, the chaos of the day settling into an eerie stillness. Daniel walked without thinking, his steps taking him past rooms filled with quiet suffering, past nurses moving like ghosts through the dim corridors, past families holding on to each other because they didn't know what else to do. He found Rachel outside near the ambulance bay, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the cold. She didn't look at him when he approached. "You should have let me walk away," she murmured. I thought about it, he admitted. Rachel huffed a small laugh, shaking her head. I meant what I said in there. I know. She finally turned to face him, her eyes shining. So what now, Chaplain? What do we do when faith isn't enough? Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath curling in the cold night air. Maybe we stop trying to have all the answers. Rachel frowned. That's not much of a solution. No, he agreed. But maybe it's a start. She stared at him for a long moment before sighing. You're lucky I don't have the energy to argue with you right now. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I'll take it. Rachel shook her head and looked up at the dark sky, her breath still unsteady. I don't know if I can believe like I used to. Then don't, Daniel said. Just be here. She let out a quiet laugh, though it sounded more like defeat. That's it. For now. Rachel didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. And maybe, for tonight, that was enough. Daniel turned his gaze upward, watching the stars peek through the gaps in the clouds. He didn't know if God was listening. He didn't know if he would ever have an answer for the kind of suffering he saw every day. But as he stood there beside someone else who was hurting, he wondered if maybe faith wasn't about understanding at all. Maybe it was just about showing up. The next morning, the hospital halls were alive with movement, but everything felt heavier. Grief had a way of lingering in the air, slipping into the spaces between heartbeats. Daniel felt it pressing against his chest as he walked toward the break room, his mind still tangled in the events of the night before. The weight of Rachel's words, of Mrs. Holloway's loss, of his own silent doubts, it all sat with him, unshaken by sleep. Inside the break room, Rachel sat at the table, stirring a cup of coffee that had likely gone cold. She didn't look up when he entered, just kept watching the slow swirl of liquid in her cup. Rough night? Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. Rachel exhaled sharply, resting her elbows on the table. That woman, Mrs. Holloway. I can't stop thinking about her. Daniel nodded. Me neither. I was standing outside her son's room before I left last night, Rachel continued. It was empty. Bed stripped, like he was never there. She let out a bitter laugh. It's cruel how fast hospitals erase someone's existence. Like the only thing that matters is making space for the next tragedy. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat across from her. It's not about erasing him. Rachel finally met his eyes. Then what is it about? Before he could answer, the door swung open, and Dr. Collins, one of the senior physicians, walked in. He was usually calm, composed, the kind of doctor who had seen everything and still never let it get to him. But today, his expression was different. Tense. Chaplain, I need you. Daniel stood immediately. What's going on? Dr. Collins hesitated before saying, the driver, the one who hit the boy. He was brought in this morning. Rachel stiffened, her grip tightening around her coffee cup. He's asterisk here asterisk. Dr. Collins nodded. Internal bleeding. He's in bad shape. Daniel's stomach turned. The thought of Mrs. Holloway, somewhere out there drowning in grief, while the man responsible for her son's death lay just down the hall. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. Rachel pushed back her chair abruptly. You've got to be kidding me. Asterisk that asterisk man gets to live. Dr. Collins shot her a warning glance. He might not, but he's asking for the chaplain. Daniel wasn't sure what shocked him more, Rachel's reaction or the fact that the driver wanted to see him. He had no idea what to expect, but there was no hesitation in his steps as he followed Dr. Collins down the hall. When they reached the room, Daniel hesitated outside the door. The man inside was the reason a child was dead. The reason a mother had spent the night breaking apart in the chapel. The reason Rachel was questioning everything she believed. And yet he was just another human being lying in a hospital bed, afraid, alone. Daniel stepped inside. The man was pale, hooked up to monitors, his breathing shallow. He looked weaker than Daniel had imagined, like a man who had already been consumed by the weight of what he had done. His eyes flickered open at the sound of footsteps, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then in a hoarse voice, the man whispered, "Am I going to die?" Daniel didn't move closer. "I don't know." The man swallowed hard. "I deserve to." Daniel didn't argue. Tears welled in the man's eyes. "I didn't see him. I swear I didn't see him." His voice cracked. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." Daniel remained silent. He could feel the confession coming before the man even spoke the next words. "I was drinking." The room felt smaller, heavier. The man let out a broken breath. "I don't even know why I got behind the wheel. I barely remember it. But I remember seeing him at the last second. I remember the impact." He squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to escape the memory. "And then I ran. I left him there." Daniel felt a sharp twist in his chest. "I wanted to stop. I wanted to help him. But I was scared. So I kept driving." The man let out a shuddering breath. "And now he's dead." Daniel studied him, unsure what to feel. He had sat with grieving mothers before. He had held the hands of people begging for answers in the face of senseless loss. But this was different. He had never sat with a person who caused the suffering. The man turned his head, meeting Daniel's eyes. "Do you think God can forgive me?" Daniel thought about Mrs. Holloway, about Rachel, about the boy who would never grow up, never get another chance. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know if he had an answer. He didn't even know if he wanted to. The door creaked open slightly, and Daniel turned to see Rachel standing there. Her expression was unreadable, but the storm in her eyes was impossible to miss. She had heard everything. She held his gaze for a long moment before turning and walking away. And just like that, the weight in Daniel's chest grew even heavier. He turned back to the man in the bed, who was watching him with wide, desperate eyes. "I don't know if God can forgive you," Daniel finally said, his voice quiet. "But I know that right now, you have to live with what you've done." The man nodded, fresh tears spilling onto his pillow. Daniel stood slowly, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he left the room, his thoughts tangled in knots. He knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not for the driver. Not for Rachel. Not for Mrs. Holloway. And certainly not for him. Daniel barely made it halfway down the hall before Rachel's voice cut through the silence. "You sat there and listened to him like he was some kind of victim." She stood just outside the nurse's station, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face set in something between disbelief and anger. A few staff members glanced their way but quickly turned back to their work, sensing the storm brewing. Daniel let out a slow breath. "I listened because he asked me to." Rachel shook her head, her jaw tight. He killed that boy. He left him in the street like his life meant nothing. And now he gets to cry about it, beg for forgiveness. Do you honestly think he deserves it? The words hit harder than Daniel expected, maybe because a part of him was asking the same question. "Deserve has nothing to do with it," he said. "Nobody deserves grace. That's why it's grace." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "You actually think God's just going to forgive him?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't know what God's going to do." "Exactly," she snapped. "Because sometimes their is no forgiveness. Sometimes there's just consequences." A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, before Daniel could respond, Rachel turned and walked away, her footsteps sharp against the tile. Daniel ran a hand down his face. Everything was unraveling at once. Rachel's faith, Mrs. Holloway's grief, the driver's guilt. And in the middle of it all, he felt himself slipping too. Where was the right answer? Where was God in all of this? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. Dr. Collins. "I don't know what you said in there," the doctor muttered, nodding toward the driver's room, but he just asked to see Mrs. Holloway. Daniel's stomach dropped. "She's here." Dr. Collins nodded. "She's in the waiting room. She said she couldn't be home alone." Daniel swallowed hard. "Do you want me to ask her?" "You're the chaplain, aren't you?" Daniel felt the weight of that title in a way he hadn't in a long time. Without another word, he made his way toward the waiting room. Mrs. Holloway sat by the window, staring blankly at the parking lot. Her hands rested in her lap, twisting her son's bracelet between her fingers. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Daniel took a slow breath and stepped forward. "Mrs. Holloway." She looked up, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or the expectation that he'd say something that would make the pain stop. Daniel sat beside her. "I need to tell you something. And I don't know if it's the right thing to ask," but he hesitated. "The driver, he's here. He wants to see you." Her expression didn't change. She just sat there, fingers tightening around the bracelet. Then after a long moment, she let out a breath. "What does he want from me?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "But I think he's carrying this in a way that's tearing him apart." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Good. Daniel felt a pang in his chest. He couldn't blame her for feeling that way. She turned her gaze back to the window. "I used to believe in forgiveness," she murmured. "I really did. But I don't think I have it in me anymore." "You don't have to," Daniel said softly. "Not today. Not ever, if you don't want to." She closed her eyes, her breath shaky. "I don't know if I can look at him and not want to destroy him." Daniel nodded. "Then maybe you shouldn't." For a long time, she didn't say anything. And then, so quietly it was almost lost in the hum of the waiting room, she whispered, "I just want to know *Y*." Daniel felt something shift in the air. He didn't know what Mrs. Holloway would do. He didn't know if she would go through that door or walk away. But either way, something was coming. Something that none of them were ready for. Mrs. Holloway sat still, staring past Daniel, past the waiting room, past everything. The question hung between them, thick and heavy. I just want to know why. Daniel could see the battle happening inside her. Rage, grief, exhaustion. And something else. Something dangerously close to curiosity. Then, without looking at him, she said, "Take me to him." Daniel hesitated. He had offered her the choice, but now that she had made it, he wasn't sure if he had done the right thing. What if seeing the man who killed her son only shattered her more? What if this pushed her further away from whatever little faith she had left? But it wasn't his decision to make anymore. He stood, waiting for her to follow. Her movements were slow, almost hesitant, but there was a steadiness in her step that hadn't been there before. A quiet resolve. As they walked toward the hospital room, Daniel's mind raced. He had expected anger, shouting, maybe even a breakdown. But he hadn't expected the eerie calm of a mother walking toward the man responsible for her child's death, as if she were walking toward the edge of something she didn't yet understand. They stopped outside the door. Mrs. Holloway exhaled sharply, gripping the doorframe. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say." Daniel swallowed. "Then don't say anything. Just listen. or walk away if it's too much. Her fingers twitched, then slowly released their grip. Okay. She pushed open the door. The driver looked smaller than before, like a man shrinking under the weight of his own guilt. His face was pale, his breathing uneven. When he saw her, his whole body tensed. Mrs. Holloway took 2 slow steps inside. The silence was unbearable. Then finally she spoke. "You wanted to see me." The driver's throat worked, like he was trying to force words up through the guilt choking him. His voice cracked. "I don't know what to say." Mrs. Holloway's expression didn't change. "Then don't waste my time." His hands gripped the blanket covering him. "I didn't mean to. I swear, I didn't mean to." His voice was hoarse, desperate. "I didn't see him until it was too late." She flinched, just barely, but she didn't move. The driver let out a shuddering breath. "I know sorry means nothing to you. I know that, but I can't live with this. I can't sleep. I can't." His voice broke. "I keep seeing him. Every time I close my eyes, I see him." Mrs. Holloway's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "Good." Daniel's chest tightened. He could see the tears building in her eyes, but her face was like stone. The driver nodded, swallowing hard. "I deserve that." For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, to Daniel's surprise, she whispered, "Do you have children?" The driver hesitated, then gave a small, broken nod. "A daughter. She's 6. A sharp, bitter breath escaped Mrs. Holloway's lips. "Then you know." Her voice was shaking now, the stone starting to crack. "You know what you took from me." The driver closed his eyes, like the weight of those words was physically crushing him. "Yes," he choked out. "I do." Mrs. Holloway let out a shaky breath, stepping back. "I don't forgive you." The driver opened his eyes, but there was no pleading in them, no expectation, just acceptance. "I know," he whispered. "I don't deserve it." She turned sharply, heading for the door. But just as she reached it, she froze. Daniel saw it a second later. Rachel, standing in the hallway, pale as a ghost. And next to her, a police officer. Daniel's stomach dropped. Mrs. Holloway turned slowly, realization dawning in her expression. She looked at Rachel, then at Daniel, then back at the driver. His face drained of what little color he had left. "Wait," he croaked. Rachel stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Daniel's. "I called the police." Daniel felt the air shift, the pieces falling into place. Rachel had been listening, watching, waiting, and now she had done what Mrs. Holloway couldn't bring herself to do. The driver's breath turned ragged. "Please," he whispered. "I wanted to turn myself in. I was going to." Rachel's voice was ice. "You had plenty of time to do that." The officer stepped forward. "Sir, we need you to come with us." The driver looked at Daniel, then Mrs. Holloway, then Rachel. His hands trembled as the officer pulled out the cuffs. Mrs. Holloway didn't say a word. She just stared, expression unreadable. Rachel didn't blink. Daniel's chest felt tight. This was justice. But why did it feel like everything was about to fall apart? The handcuffs clicked into place, the sound sharp and final. The driver barely resisted as the officer secured them around his wrists, his shoulders slumped, his face hollow. He didn't plead. He didn't fight. He just closed his eyes, breathing out slowly, like he had been waiting for this moment all along. Mrs. Holloway stood frozen, watching it happen, but her face was unreadable. Rachel, on the other hand, stood rigid, arms crossed, her gaze locked onto the driver like she was making sure he didn't somehow slip away. Daniel should have felt relief. The man responsible was being held accountable. Mrs. Holloway had gotten what she deserved, justice. But why didn't it feel right? Why did something still feel unfinished? Then, just as the officer started leading the driver out of the room, Mrs. Holloway's voice cut through the silence. "Wait." Everyone stopped. Even the officer hesitated, looking back at her. She took a slow, uneven step forward, her breath trembling. "Tell me the truth." The driver turned, his eyes heavy with guilt. "I already did." "No," she shook her head. "Not the part about being drunk. Not the part about being scared. The real truth." Daniel frowned. "Mrs. Holloway, what are you?" She ignored him, her gaze locked onto the driver. "You said you didn't see him until it was too late." Her voice was steady now, but there was something sharp beneath it. But was that really the truth? The driver hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. And that was enough. Rachel's arms tightened around her chest. Of course it's the truth. He was drunk. He wasn't paying attention. But Mrs. Holloway wasn't looking at Rachel. She was looking at *him*. And Daniel saw it too. The way the driver's hands clenched. The way his breathing changed. The way his entire body tensed, like a man standing on the edge of something too dark to admit. Daniel's stomach dropped. "Tell me," Mrs. Holloway whispered. For the first time, the driver looked truly afraid. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely existed, he said, "I saw him." Rachel inhaled sharply. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. The room shrank, the walls pressing in, the air turning thick with something neither grief nor rage could explain. Mrs. Holloway's expression didn't change. "Then why didn't you stop?" The driver's lips trembled. His throat worked like the words were physically choking him. And then, finally, "Because I thought he was someone else." Silence. A terrible, stretching silence. Rachel's mouth parted slightly, confusion flickering across her face. "What?" The driver swallowed hard. I thought he was someone else." His voice cracked. "There was this guy. Owed some bad people money. Looked just like your son from a distance. And for a second, I thought." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Daniel felt like the floor had vanished beneath him. Mrs. Holloway just stood there, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "You're saying," her voice was thin, like a thread about to snap. "You hit him on purpose. The driver shook his head violently. "No, I mean, yes. But not him. I mean, I didn't know it was." His words tangled, collapsing over themselves. "I swear to you, the second I realized it wasn't who I thought, I panicked. I ran. Mrs. Holloway staggered back like she had been struck. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God. Daniel couldn't move. Everything they had thought, everything was wrong. This wasn't just a tragic accident. It wasn't just a reckless mistake. It was something else entirely. The officer, snapping out of his shock, tightened his grip on the driver's arm. "That's enough." His voice was suddenly hard. "You'll finish this at the station." But Mrs. Holloway didn't seem to hear him. She was still staring at the driver, her eyes hollow, her breath uneven. Daniel saw it then, the moment something inside her broke beyond repair. The driver's eyes filled with tears. "I swear I never meant." The word was barely more than a whisper, but it silenced the entire room. Mrs. Holloway turned, her face pale, her body trembling. She looked at Daniel like she wanted him to say something, to make it make sense. But there was nothing left to say. The officer pulled the driver toward the door, and this time, he didn't resist. As they disappeared down the hall, Rachel let out a shuddering breath. She shook her head, unable to finish. Mrs. Holloway wiped at her face, smearing away tears that had no end. She turned toward the window, gripping the edge of the bed for balance. And Daniel just stood there, realizing the one thing none of them had been prepared for. Justice had finally come. But it didn't bring peace. It never did. The hallway felt too quiet after the officer led the driver away. The absence of his presence left an eerie weight in the air, like something unfinished still lingered in the room. Mrs. Holloway stood frozen by the window, her back to everyone, staring at nothing. Rachel hadn't moved either, her arms still tightly crossed, her expression unreadable. Daniel exhaled, running a hand down his face. He had thought this would be over once the truth came out, that answers would bring closure. But closure didn't come. It never did. Rachel finally spoke, her voice hoarse. "I thought I wanted this." Daniel turned to her. "You don't." She shook her head, rubbing at her arms like she was suddenly cold. "I don't know. I thought that if he got arrested, if he paid for what he did, it would feel right. But it doesn't. It just feels empty." Daniel nodded slowly. "Justice isn't the same as peace." Rachel scoffed, but there was no real fight behind it. "Then what brings peace? Because I sure don't see it here." Mrs. Holloway turned then, her eyes dull and tired. "Nothing does." Her voice was soft, but the certainty in it was unshakable. Not justice. Not answers. Not even God. Daniel felt those words settle deep inside him. And for once, he had no response. Mrs. Holloway smoothed out the fabric of her shirt, taking a slow breath. "I think I need to go home." Rachel nodded quickly, almost too quickly, like she had been waiting for a reason to leave too. "I'll drive you." Daniel watched as they gathered their things, moving through the motions without really thinking. There was no relief on their faces, no sense of victory, just exhaustion. Before she walked out, Mrs. Holloway turned back to him. Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something. Maybe ask a question, maybe leave a final thought. But in the end, she just nodded once, then left. Rachel followed, but not before giving Daniel a long, searching look. It wasn't anger or frustration this time. It was something else, something uncertain. And then she was gone. Daniel sat down heavily in one of the plastic waiting room chairs, staring at the floor. Where was God in all of this? He had spent years comforting people with that question, but tonight he had no easy answers. All he had was a pit in his stomach and the knowledge that even when justice had been served, it still didn't bring back what was lost. The next few days passed in a blur. The driver's arrest was all over the news. Headlines flashing words like asterisk manslaughter asterisk and asterisk intent asterisk and asterisk new evidence asterisk. People debated whether his confession changed anything. Some said it made it worse. Others argued it didn't matter. An accident or not, a boy was still gone. Daniel tried to check in on Mrs. Holloway, but she wasn't answering her phone. He wasn't sure if she wanted space or if she had finally reached the point where no amount of words could touch her grief. Rachel was avoiding him too. When he saw her at the hospital, she nodded politely but never stopped to talk. There was distance between them now, like something had shifted permanently. He couldn't blame her. One evening, just as he was about to leave for the night, his phone buzzed. A text. It was from Mrs. Holloway. Asterisk, can you meet me at the church? Asterisk. Daniel didn't hesitate. When he arrived, she was already inside, sitting in the back pew. The sanctuary was dimly lit, the only light coming from the faint glow of the candles near the altar. He walked slowly toward her, unsure of what to say. She beat him to it. I don't know why I asked you here, she admitted, staring straight ahead. I don't even know if I believe in any of this anymore. Daniel sat beside her, leaving space between them. That's okay. She let out a small, breathy laugh. Is it? He nodded. God doesn't need you to have it all figured out. She was quiet for a long moment. Then in a voice so soft it was barely there, she asked, do you still believe? After everything? Daniel thought about it, really thought about it. Did he? He still believed in grace, in the idea that redemption was real. But after witnessing so much pain, so much loss, he wasn't sure if he understood God the way he used to. I don't know, he admitted finally, but I want to. She nodded slowly, like that answer made sense to her. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the bracelet. Her son's bracelet. She turned it over in her fingers, tracing the worn beads. I want to let go, she whispered, but I don't know how. Daniel swallowed hard. Maybe you don't have to. Maybe some things aren't meant to be let go of. Maybe you just learn how to carry them differently. Her fingers tightened around the bracelet. And what if I don't want to carry it anymore? Daniel hesitated, then held out his hand. Then maybe you don't have to do it alone. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't take it. But then slowly, she placed the bracelet in his palm. It was warm. He closed his fingers around it, feeling the weight of it. Not a burden, not something to be erased, just something to be held. Mrs. Holloway let out a shaky breath and wiped at her eyes. Thank you, Daniel. She stood up, taking one last look at the altar before walking toward the door. Daniel stayed behind, staring at the cross above the pulpit. There were no easy answers, no perfect endings. But maybe faith wasn't about certainty. Maybe it was about still searching, even when you didn't have all the answers. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.